Since the Second World War, the tank has provided the shock force of modern land armies. Nowhere was this more evident than in the land battles of Operation Desert Storm. This video ordnance program examines the tanks and the tank crews of the United States Army. The rumble of tank tracks is a familiar sound at remote army bases every summer as National Guard tank units arrive for their annual exercises. The tank is a central part of all modern armies and has served with American forces from the formative years of the First World War through Operation Desert Storm. The first American tank units were formed in France in 1917, commanded by a little-known Colonel, George Patton. Their tanks were the hardy little French Renault FT. The Renault was the first modern tank fitted with a traversing turret like all succeeding tanks. It was very unlike the more ponderous land ships of the British Army, though the American Army had a battalion of these as well. The Renaults and their American-built copies were necessary as American industry had little success manufacturing its own tanks before the end of the war. In the 1920s, American inventors tackled the challenge of tank design with considerable enthusiasm, though not always with great success. The early tanks, like this Cunningham light tank, were little removed from their World War I ancestors. They were not very fast, not well protected, and not well armed. But then, neither were those of most European armies of the time. American tank design in the 1930s suffered from the small army budget and the presumption that America would never again become involved in another European land war. Tanks seemed irrelevant to traditional army missions, patrolling the Mexican border or policing actions in the distant Philippines. Some of the tank designs of the 1930s showed considerable imagination. Walter Christie developed a series of fast tanks that could be driven cross-country on their tracks or much faster on roads with their tracks removed. The U.S. Army bought a handful of Christie's and played with the idea for some years. But it was in Europe that Christie's designs had their greatest impact. The Soviet Union built a derivative of the Christie tank called the BT. This led to the T-34 tank in 1940, the finest tank at the beginning of World War II. And Britain used the Christie suspension on some of its tanks, such as the Crusader. As war clouds brewed in Europe, the U.S. Army paid greater attention to tank design. Its designs in the late 1930s were uninspiring compared to many European designs. When Europe went to war in 1939, the U.S. Army's tank force was about the same size as that of the small European powers, Italy, Poland, Romania. Urgent work was begun. The U.S. Army entered World War II with two principal tank types: light tanks such as the M2A4 and M3, and medium tanks such as the M3. The M3 medium tank used an unusual configuration with its main 75mm gun in the hull and a smaller 37mm gun in a separate turret. This peculiar arrangement was due to the fact that American industry could not yet cast turrets large enough to accommodate the powerful 75mm gun. The idea for the M3 medium tank's gun arrangement came from the French Char B tank, one of the most powerful tanks in the world in 1940. The M3 medium tank and its smaller companion, the M3 light tank, saw their combat debut in the hands of the British, provided through Lend-Lease. American tanks developed a reputation for automotive excellence and durability even though their armor protection and firepower often fell short compared to German tanks. A new tank was on the drawing boards, the M4, better known as the Sherman. The Sherman tank was the mainstay of the US tank force in World War II. The Sherman was a good tank in 1942 and 1943 when it first entered service, but the US Army did not appreciate how rapidly German tank development was progressing. The main tank battles were fought on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union. New German tanks, like the Panther and the Tiger, were developed to deal with the Soviet tanks like the T-34 with its Christie suspension. The new German tanks were twice as heavy as the Sherman, and their powerful guns could easily punch through the Sherman's thinner armor. By the time the US Army faced its greatest challenge after the Normandy invasion in 1944, its Sherman tanks were outgunned by the better-armed Panther and Tiger. Even the improved version with its 76mm gun could barely penetrate the German tank's thicker armor. Fortunately, the German tank force was weakened considerably by Allied air power. Large-scale tank battles of the type seen on the Eastern Front were a rarity on the Western Front. The Sherman, because of its reliability, proved adequate to do the job. The most powerful American armored vehicle of World War II was the T-28 Super Heavy tank. It was not designed to fight other tanks, but to duel with heavy fortifications of the type expected on the German Siegfried line. It was so heavy that it had to have 4 sets of tracks instead of the usual 2. Its thick armor was nearly impervious to any conventional land artillery. But in a war of maneuver, its weight was a major drawback, and none ever saw combat. The shortcomings of the Sherman led to the development of a new tank to replace it, the M26 Pershing. The Pershing was not as heavy as the T-28, rather it was about the same size as the deadly German Panther tank, and armed with a 90mm gun. During the Korean War, the Pershing and the Sherman were used in tank battles with the Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, manned by the North Korean and Chinese armies. The appearance of Soviet heavy tanks like the Joseph Stalin III tank prompted the US Army to design even heavier tanks. But like the T-28, these faded into obscurity. Another idea was a super lightweight tank hunter, such as the tiny Ontos tank destroyer. Ontos, a Greek word meaning the thing, was designed as a cheap substitute for tanks. It was armed with 6 recoilless rifles, giving it enormous firepower for so small a vehicle. But it lacked the combat endurance of more conventional tanks, and only a small number were used by the Marine Corps. American tank evolution remained concentrated on medium tanks, which eventually came to be called main battle tanks, absorbing the role of light, medium, and heavy tanks. The Pershing was followed by evolutionary improvements, the M47 and M48 Patton tanks. These formed the core of the US Army's tank divisions during the Cold War. The final evolutionary development of the M26 Pershing tank was the M60, appearing in 1960, nearly 25 years after its predecessor. The M60 tank has evolved for 20 years into the M60A1, A2, and finally today's M60A3 versions. In the US Army today, there are tank units manned by regular Army units and by members of the National Guard. The regular units are composed of professional, full-time soldiers who have made the Army their career. But the United States Army, like an increasing number of armies faced with shrinking budgets, cannot afford to base its entire force structure on professional troops. Instead, a portion of the force structure is made up of reservists and part-time soldiers who can be mobilized in the event of a national emergency or a major war. The National Guard has played a special role in the U.S. Army force structure and looks with pride on its historical role in America's tank force. Typical of National Guard tank units is the 210th Armor, part of the New York National Guard's 42nd Infantry Division.
Well, we are part of an infantry division, and all infantry divisions do have armor units in it. Obviously, an armor division will have more armor units in it than an infantry division. In the division, there are 2 armor battalions and 1 cav unit that has tanks. We're located in Albany, and our sister battalion is located in Buffalo, New York. Both of us are configured with the M60A3 TTS tank, and so is the cav.
A tank battalion, such as the 1st of the 210th Armor, has over 50 tanks. The tankers of the 210th Armor come from all walks of life: electricians, truck drivers, carpenters. Many served earlier in regular Army tank battalions. The experience of the Guards tankers is very different from regular Army service. The Guardsmen spend less time with their military tasks, but the units have a stronger tie to the local community.
There's definitely a sense of pride and patriotism of being part of the National Guard. It definitely isn't for the money. If you're the good soldiers, and there are a lot of them in this division particularly, are the type of person that are not here for the money, but here to do a job and know that they have a spot in the total force concept to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the United States Army.
Being a tanker in the National Guard demands special commitment. It takes a great deal of effort to learn the intricacies of operating a high-performance tank. The extra effort required of tankers in Guard units is rewarded by the challenge and excitement.
It's just, there's certain people that like being on the tanks, and I'm one of those people. I just like being on the tank. I don't know if it's, you know, the big thing is when there's gunneries. You know, I think most guys really love to go down and shoot the big bullets.
The 210th Armor is equipped with the M60A3 tank. This battalion had the older M48 Patton tank until recently, which did not have the sophisticated features of the M60A3. Although the M60A3 is not the Army's newest tank, it is still a very complex piece of machinery.
This is an M60A3 tank with tank thermal sights. With this sort of tank, we can fire on the move. It has stabilization, has a laser rangefinder, has thermal sights for night engagements without illumination. We've been using this track vehicle for about 2 years now. We switched over from the M48 A5s. Oh, they're great. They're much better than the 48s.
The crew of an M60 tank is 4 men. The tank commander, the gunner, the loader, and the driver. The tank commander is the senior member of the crew.
The tank commander is responsible basically for everyone in the tank, for the safety, and ensure the gunner, and you lay the gunner on his target. When the tank commander or a crew member identifies a target, the tank commander just goes ahead and issues his fire command, and you all work together to get the target destroyed.
The tank commander sits in the right rear portion of the tank turret. He operates the .50 caliber machine gun mounted in a small sub-turret or cupola located on the top of the main turret. Inside the turret, he has a complex set of controls to carry out his tasks.
This piece of equipment right here is a tank commander override, and he can move the tank, turret, right, left, elevate the gun, depress the gun, fire the gun, and do some lead if he's firing at a moving target. This piece of equipment is the night sight. It's an extension from the gunner's night sight, so we can see exactly what the gunner's seeing at night or during the day, because sometimes this sight works a lot better than your daylight sight. This piece of equipment right here is a laser rangefinder, and what it does is it sends a laser out, reflects off the target, comes back, and that will give you your range. This piece of equipment here is your 50 caliber night sight. It's a passive elbow. This is your 50 caliber day sight. The passive elbow will gather the ambient light source, and it gathers it and it makes it that much more brighter, whereas the thermal sight is based on temperature contrast. A human being has much more heat than a tree, and at night this system will basically take that and reflect it on almost like a television screen in there, and it's all done with electronics, and it's very, very well defined, and that's why the Army's gone now and said that this will be your primary sight from now on, even during the day.
The next crewman in seniority is the gunner. The gunner sits in front of the commander and operates the main 105mm gun on the tank commander's instructions. He controls the elevation and traverse of the main gun and operates its many other features, including the stabilization system and laser rangefinder.
This thing here is a gunner's control unit. Got your stabilization. This is the power to turn it on. Your null knobs, traversing knobs. It's your ammo select unit. These are Cadillac's traverse to turn it. You got the TTS right here. This is your daylight channel. This is your 105 Delta.
The stabilization system automatically compensates for rough terrain and motion, keeping the tank gun aimed precisely at a given point, even during movement. Another innovation of the M60A3 is the laser rangefinder. In spite of the power of modern tank guns, the projectile drops several feet during the course of its flight due to gravity. By accurately determining the range of the target, the tank's ballistic computer can calculate how many degrees the gun must be elevated to compensate for gravity.
Laser fires out, it comes back, and through the computer we have a readout that tells us what the range is to it. It automatically ranges to it, and then it automatically indexes the elevation for the main gun, for the type of ammo index.
The third tanker in the turret is the loader, responsible for loading the main gun. The loader must combine strength and agility. Each of these rounds of ammunition weighs over 50 pounds. They must be carefully loaded into the breech of the gun, even when the tank is bouncing and crashing across rough terrain. Isolated from the turret crew in the front of the hull is the driver. Driving a modern tank is surprisingly simple, but care must be taken as an M60 weighs over 60 tons and can reach speeds over 30 miles an hour.
Well, I'll tell you, the tanks probably ride better than most cars on the road. You have the throttle pedal, the brake pedal, and you use a T-bar instead of a steering wheel. And what the T-bar does is it locks up the brakes on the side of the track that you want to go on. If you ever ridden a snowmobile, you know, you just turn the T-bar side to side.
Even though a modern tank like the M60 is relatively easy to drive, it requires constant attention from its crew. Unlike the family car, a tank requires maintenance every day it is being used.
You can just see, because of the size and the weight of the tank, there's a tremendous amount of stress on the parts, the road wheels, the suspension system altogether, the hull, the checking your oils, your batteries. You guys were in the turret earlier, so you saw how complicated the fire control system is, and you constantly have to do computer checks and night sight checks. So yeah, there's a lot of maintenance involved, but that comes with the territory. Probably close to 50% of being a tanker is pulling maintenance.
A task unique to tankers is called bore sighting. The M60A3 has 4 sights that must be carefully aligned to ensure that the projectile will hit its target. The care that the tank crew takes in maintaining the gun system determines the long-range accuracy of the weapon.
You need a bore sight to bring all your sights, your TTS, your daylight channel, your 105, and your laser rangefinder sight in alignment with the main gun, the center of the main gun.
Whoa! Come on down. Come on down. Whoa! Come to your left. Nice and easy. Nice and slow.
With their guns bore-sighted, the tankers of the 210th Armour head to the live fire ranges to practice their gunnery skills. Practice ammunition is loaded before reaching the range.
Gunner, Sable, tank.
Identified.
Jump.
Blazing.
Fire.
On the way.
Identified! Up! Raging! Fire! On the way! Target falling track! Take a stop! Relays! Up! Raging! Fire! On the way! Target falling track! Turbo home!
The American tank force traces its ancestry back to the infantry, artillery, and cavalry branches. It retains its strongest emotional ties to the cavalry. The closest reminder of its cavalry heritage is its scout and armored cavalry units. A tank battalion like the 1st of the 210th Armour has over 50 tanks divided into several companies. But in addition to the tanks, the battalion also has a scout platoon.
Primary function of scouts is reconnaissance. What we do mainly is go out in front of the battalion and search for information. And once we get that information, we make sure it gets back to the battalion.
Armored scout vehicles have changed considerably over time. In the years before World War II, most scout vehicles were armored cars. Such vehicles were faster than tanks. They were not as well protected or as well armed, since their mission was to find the enemy, not to fight the enemy. In World War II, armored cars and light tanks were used in this role. After the war, the U.S. Army continued to use light tanks for this role. The M24 Chaffee during the Korean conflict, and later the M41 and Sheridan. With the advent of powerful anti-tank guided missiles in the 1960s, the Army began to use missile-armed vehicles in the armored cavalry role. In the National Guard tank battalions, the tanks are supported by a scout platoon of M901 improved tow vehicles. The ITV is based on the highly successful M113 infantry transporter. Its main difference is this hammerhead launcher, which can fire the tow anti-tank missile. The hammerhead assembly on the roof of the vehicle allows the ITV to hide behind terrain with only the missile launcher itself exposed to enemy fire. Scout and armored cavalry units of the active army are equipped with the Bradley fighting vehicle. The Bradley is best known as an infantry transporter, but when it was first designed, the Bradley was also adapted for the cavalry role in a version called the M3 Cavalry Fighting Vehicle. The Bradley is better armed and armored than the ITV, but for scouts, the main mission remains its traditional one, to find the enemy. The ground campaign during the Gulf War was a tankers' war. American tanks formed the sharp end of the sword in the attacks on the Iraqi army. The M60 tank was used by the tank battalions of the U.S. Marine Corps. Some modifications had been made compared to the National Guard M60 we saw earlier. To better protect the tank against Iraqi anti-tank missiles, some of the M60s had a new reactive armor layered on top of their existing steel armor. When struck by an enemy missile, this armor explodes outward and weakens the impact of the enemy warhead. Army tank battalions in the Gulf were equipped with the new M1 Abrams tank, which had first entered service in the 1980s. The latest model, called the M1A1 Heavy Armor, enjoyed many advantages over the older M60. The Abrams night fighting equipment allowed American tankers to engage and destroy Iraqi tanks long before the Iraqi tankers could even see the Americans. The relentless speed of the attack, made possible by the Abrams' new turbine engine, made it impossible for the Iraqi commanders to react quickly enough to American maneuvers. And the new armor, bolstered by a layer of dense uranium metal, proved very effective. The stunning victory of American tankers against the Iraqi army was a vindication of the new tank technology. But it was also a vindication of the tankers, their training, and their tactics. The quality of tank crews remains every bit as essential as their technological quality, a traditional hallmark of the Yank tank.